just so you know, this is the Child Abuse Prevention Speaker Series, and this is the final of the speaker series. We have had 3. This is the 4th. If you're interested in any of the past speaker series, we have all of them on our YouTube channel. I'll have my colleague Stephanie put in our link tree, and we have a lot of different YouTube on our YouTube channel. We've got our speaker series, we've got our financial literacy, which is going on right now, our diversity, and then our regional meetings. So it's really a great chance for you to see kind of what we're doing if you've missed any of those. And so it is my pleasure. I'm very pleased. He told me not to read his bio, so I'm not going to read his bio, but I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Corey Best. Just a real fascinating and really dynamic speaker. And so we're super excited to have him and yourselves to be here on this Wednesday afternoon. But again, I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Corey Best, our guest speaker this evening. So Mr. Best.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy. I'm honored to be in this space with you, and good afternoon, evening to everybody. The sun's sort of starting to set here, and I've had an opportunity to kind of listen to a little bit of jazz. I don't know what the favorite is based on Tracy and Dural's preferences, but Miles was good for me. So I appreciate the invitation first and foremost, and for you all, really taking an opportunity to engage with me in a much needed conversation. I do believe that this backdrop of historical, and I know Shenandoah Shefflow, she talked a little bit about racial trauma and healing. So I want to build on some of where Shen took us and have us to think about systems change in a different way. So we talk about systems change and transformation in the vein of this nebulous, gigantic, almost invisible thing out there that makes it really, really hard for us to wrap our heads around. And how do we get there? And are we focusing on the problem too much? Or what are the solutions? And we ask questions over and over again. How do I, or what do I do to ensure that, one, we're preventing child abuse and neglect, and 2, we are strengthening families? So the short answer, I'm going to unpack sort of what I mean, but the short answer is that I believe that systems change starts with me. So there's been a lot of things that I have learned in my life. I've had wonderful and amazing people deposit nuggets of wisdom into me. And my grandmother taught me some years ago. Saturday, she's been in heaven for a year. So her spirit and her energy is with me, stronger than it has been in the previous year rather. And so what she often taught us as children was that there's no such thing as a neutral system or a neutral individual. And I never really understood that until I got into the work of family engagement, and my career started in primary prevention and protective factors and focusing on all the positive things that happen in community, which is also why I cultivated and branded Mining for Gold, because I also believe that each and every one of us as human beings, we have at least 2 ounces of proverbial gold within us. And as systems, we often go into people looking for dirt, right? And some of our interconnected human services systems, even our nonprofits, even our preventative services, sometimes they become surveillance for our CPS system. And those families who have amazing gifts, amazing attributes, are often enthralled in a system that sometimes causes harm. And so to go back to what my grandmother taught us about, there's no such thing as neutrality, right? I always thought growing up that you have to be neutral or what have you, but she often said that, Corey, everybody has a position. And it's up to us to honor and own that position. And when we own our positions in life, she taught me that we know exactly what we're saying yes to. And so my grandmother taught me to say yes to building something better, not always fighting against the system, because the current systems have been constructed in a way and are producing outcomes as designed, right? So there's no neutrality there. So we created it in a way, and the way we created it produces the outcomes that we see today for kids and families. Nothing neutral about that, right?
Mhm.
So I've chosen to take a stance on a hill of wild imagination, right? Understanding, what am I becoming in this work? Sean Wright teaches me that the first wrong question is, what do I do about it? And the first right question is, who am I becoming as I'm building something new? And so that's where the focus is. And I'm going to put some questions. Let's consider them. Let's consider them journaling prompts. And I have them in the chat now. You don't have to respond to any of those in the chat, but just travel, as I say, travel with them throughout the duration of this conversation. I have about 430 years worth of history I'm going to try to pack in to about 40 minutes. So bear with me. Right? So bear with me. So everybody's here because we play a role in prevention. We know that prevention, child abuse and neglect is preventable. There's research, and we are kind of confused about how we get there, right? I think that in my experiences, at least, and this won't be the most favorable statement to make, because we know the trauma that comes with abuse, the trauma that comes with neglect, and we also know that some kids, unfortunately, are egregiously abused at the hands of their caregivers, right? And that's hard to see from the field. It's hard to read in the newspapers. It's hard to witness if you're in community and you see these things. But at the same time, what we know, at least in child welfare, those are not the bulk of the cases. And we've created a system that focuses on, depending on the year, 14 to 17% of children in our nation's foster care system today have been, unfortunately, egregiously, sexually, physically, psychologically at the hands of their caregivers. And that leaves 80 some odd percent of families and children who are in our care for neglect related occurrences. And over the past 10, 15 years, we've started to study and develop evidence that shows that we are, as a country, conflating poverty and neglect. And so it reminds me of this, the allegory of prevention, right? So the thing that I wanted to say that's not going to be most favorable is a part of understanding me in the system is that sometimes we have to build tolerance and fortitude to tolerate risk. That's hard, like for us as helpers, right? Like, what do you mean tolerate risk? I'm not saying to accept unsafe environments, to accept that abuse and neglect occurs. Absolutely not. But I'm asking us to understand that we will never be able to prevent everything from happening, right? It's unfortunate, but it's also a reality. And two things can be true at once. We can build the best system to keep kids safe, to keep kids healthy, to keep families smiling and thriving. And unfortunately, some people will still do yucky things, right? That's just a reality. And so when I think about the allegory of prevention, and this will weave into an invitation that I have when it comes to structures and race and racism, I think about this upstream story that I heard some years ago. And many of you probably already heard it too, so I'm just going to shorten it. And it is the story of helpers and community pulling babies out of the river, right? And then some stories say that when we noticed through our work that the chubbier babies floated better. So we didn't focus on the chubbier babies, we focused on the skinnier babies because they sank, right? So we were pulling them out of the river, right? And then one day somebody says, hey, I am going to break away from this pack and I'm going to go, you can finish the sentence, upstream, right? And so people are saying, like, what are you doing? We need to be here to get these children out of the river. Absolutely, we need people there. But the gentleman says that I want to go further up to understand why people are falling into the river in the first place. And so the story continues, and I'm going to read just a snippet of it for you here before I open up the slideshow. Is as you look further upstream, you start to notice bridges in various states of repair along the river. Some are strong, some are sturdy, some have great components, others are weak, dilapidated, debilitated, with missing boards and flimsy railings. It doesn't surprise you that most of the people fall into the river or crossing the poorly made bridges, and those individuals that live near travel across the stone bridges are protected. Of course, all of the bridges could use more reinforcement, obviously, but it's really easy for us, especially if we're looking, to see which bridges need the most attention. In this parable, we know that certain groups of people don't fall into the river because of individual weakness or intrinsic flaws. Rather, we know that some people are more advantaged, are more privileged, and live in communities with strong bridges, usually made of high quality materials that protect them from falling into the river and promote their safe passage across the bridge. Now, I want you to think about that as I open up the slideshow, because there's a deeper invitation here. And what I want to invite us to think about here is, okay, there it is, my slide sharing. What I want us to think about again is are you seeing, there it is. How are we creating the system that we want to see? And I see it's giving us a little bit of pause here.
We're just still seeing that you're sharing, but it's coming on now.
Okay. All right. Just bear with me. I hope that this won't be on the evaluation, Sylvia. So just give me a little bit of grace. I'm just for those of you who are listening, I'm not in my normal space. I'm in a hotel in Washington, D.C. So are you seeing the slideshow now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that is strange because now you are?
We still see a partiality of it, Corey.
Yeah, we see the PowerPoint setup, but it kind of like just froze on slide 1.
Yeah, and there's not much else that we can see.
Okay. Okay, so how about, oh my good people, my apologies.
No worries, no worries at all.
There it is. I think we're good.
There it is.
Yep.
There it is. Okay.
There it is.
That was, I wish I could say that was part of the show, but that's that risk tolerance that I was talking about, Sylvia, right? So I got to tolerate a little risk. Being in the hot seat, it can get a little testy up here sometimes. So we breathe, we come back, and here we are, good people. So what must happen first? I believe that Corey, must be the change that I want to see. So as opposed to digging for dirt, I go into individuals thinking about how might I find gold, right? Knowing that the gold is there, knowing exactly if I do not find it, then I am not looking hard enough. The invitation for today, for these next 40 some odd minutes, is to listen from your heart and take responsibility for our own feelings and assumptions. Utilize those journaling prompts that I gave you to make deeper sense of what you're feeling in your bodies as I go through the presentation. cultivate community conditions where liberation and belonging are foundational and necessary, not exceptional. Think about, is it possible for systems to change without people changing? And please make room for radical thinking and imagination. And so please feel free to use the chat here. I'll try to make it as interactive as possible. Remember the allegory of prevention for just a moment. We understand that some bridges are built with sturdier materials. Some bridges and communities have been what we call disinvested in, right? And so through the naked eye, sometimes we see beautiful, right? Beautiful Black and brown and non-white children and white children alike. But sometimes we see beautiful brown and Black children and we look back at them and we say, whoa, you didn't earn it. You're not smart enough. You're not fast enough. And there must be something intrinsically wrong with you. And many of us in today's world did not inherit the system we have. Sometimes we uphold it. So this young man here is showing some signs of physical despair, emotional despair. I'm curious if anybody wants to say what they see on this slide. When you look at this American Dream game, what are you seeing? I'll take 1 second to look at the chat. Sylvia, I see you coming in, please.
I think that it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself, right? Like you can close your eyes and think this image can take you back 50, 80, 100 years, but it can also take you where we are right now.
And so, Sylvia, you have just said it a lot better than I would, that our history shapes our present, right? And when I look at children, so many of us have begun to understand race and racism a lot differently since May 25th, 2020, when we saw almost 10 minutes, one person put his knee on another person's neck. And many of us might have said a couple of things through that process. One, in our human services field and at the Children's Bureau and all of our interconnected systems, we see that there are racial disparities in all systems. So what I want to say with confidence is that racism looks the same in every single system. Sometimes it manifests itself differently. When I think about racism, I'm thinking about an institution and outcome, the outcomes based on the color line, the outcomes based on race, the outcomes based on ethnicity, the outcomes based on how we have invented race, and that has created othering individuals, right? So when I see this kid who didn't graduate high school because he was suspended 50 times from the 10th grade through the 11th grade and he gave up, right? Some of us might call him dumb. Some of us might say he didn't want to work hard enough. Some of us might say he was not smart enough. Or some of us might say that these disparities are because children are Black and children are brown. To go back to George Floyd for a second, many of us might have even said that that happened to him because he was Black. Many of us might have even said that Black and brown people get pulled over at traffic lights at a higher rate than their white colleagues and friends and family members because they are Black. The first pro tip for today, good people, is to understand that Blackness is not the deficit, right? Right. So when we say that things happen to Black and brown people because they are Black and brown, we're saying that Black and brown is the problem. Right? Nah, that's not true. Right? That's not true. So I want us to even reframe, right? And understand that there's some things that have happened that created conditions for individuals to experience poverty. And the second pro tip is that we've, as an American society, we've taken a person's conditions and made it their identity. You know how we say people are poor, people are homeless, people are abused. right? Right? People live in abusive conditions, right? People live in impoverished conditions. People experience homelessness. I don't know a person that is homeless, right? So even how we language and message things will give us just one good head start to understanding that there's so much that we need to know. And Sylvia, you took us there, right? So I'm just gonna pull out a couple of dates here without going through the entire history. I told you 400 and something years. I'm gonna put it in 40 minutes and I'm gonna do it well with a smile on my face. So if we start, just start the conversation at 1619 or even 1776, when America formed an identity, right? So America formed an identity in 1776, and that identity was that all men are created equal. When indigenous folks recognized that they had broken treaties, their land had been stolen, right? They recognized that they were not being treated as equals. So we hear this thing today called white supremacy, and it may cause a reaction for some. But when we look at the founding fathers' documents and see that women weren't included in all men are created equal, that gay people weren't included in all men are created equal, non-white identities weren't included in that definition of all men are created equal. So that leaves us to, I'm going to go all the way up to 1909 when the White House had its first conference on the care for the dependent children. And then shortly after that, the Children's Bureau was born, right, in 1912, right? And so think about those 2 years. Where were Black and brown kids in this equation? In 1909 and 1912? And where were the indigenous children in this equation, right? In 1909 and 1912? Remember what my grandmother said, her name is Nanny. No neutral system, right? So Black and brown kids weren't even invited into the conversation about welfare until the 60s, right? Until the 60s. So we're talking about humanity here for a moment. And what I mean by humanity is that everybody knew that they were human beings and should be treated as human beings from the time that they came to these colonies. And I also want to just make a note here that Black people is the only group of people who never wanted to come to these Americas, right? Black people were forced to come to these Americas. Indigenous people were here. Everybody else migrated to these Americas for that American dream that we saw before, right? And so these are some things that I want us to think about as we are thinking about progress, retrenchment, growth, building a new system, that legal humanity for all people is a 58, 59-year-old concept. So in 1964, it took a piece of legislation that said that all men are now to be treated as equals, treated as human beings by rule of law. But what we do is we still infringe upon some people's 14th and 4th Amendment rights when we go into their homes, look into their refrigerators and say they ain't got enough food and they're abusing their child. That's seizure, good people. Your home is the most protected thing that you have as an American in this society. You have rights to protect it. You have rights to love it. And you also have rights that should not be infringed upon, right? All of us. So even in our work, we are sometimes part of a system that is abusing communities and families. So when we talk about prevention of child abuse and neglect, I want us to understand that sometimes there are societal systems at play that neglect whole communities of people that often lead and become sort of the foundation or the platform for us to focus on familial or parental neglect and abuse. I'm not saying that anybody on this call is an oppressive thinker, but we're connected to a system that has proven to cause some kind of harm to many groups of individuals, right? And I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize where I have power, where you have power to make lasting change. And it begins with how we see the world. right? So when I think about how we see the world, it starts with framing. In everybody's mind, we have an ideology. That ideology comes from a place we can look at this beautiful Black girl here. To me, she looks like she's between 15 and 18 years old. Looks like it's an urban city. Anybody can put their hands up and say, I've taken a selfie, I have cropped a picture, I have used a filter, I have put it on social media because I don't want people to see those pimples on my face. I don't want people to see in the background. I'm in a hotel room right now. If I took a selfie, I would crop all of that. I don't even know what that blue moon is back there, right? I just don't like it. So I wouldn't want people to see it, right? So I would not show that. And so put yourself in that position for just a moment as I walk you through this framing. See, you have a frame and an ideology, and then you also, with that ideology comes with values, beliefs, assumptions, norms about people, and narratives about people that have been given to you. So there's a message that we say in social justice work is that many of us as human beings, we do not pull from history, we pull from memory. See, the stereotype is already embedded. If you go back to the 1800s and you think about people who were coming from Europe to come to America for holiday, the stories about who Black and brown people were was already across that pond. And so when they got here, they believed something about people that was absolutely false. And those form our ideology. Our ideology is baked in our policies. Our ideology is baked in our system. Remember, policy doesn't write itself, right? Sylvia, me and you get together and we write a policy, and we have to say that we're going to create a prototype for a human being. Guess what? That human being is going to be Corey and Sylvia. By the way, my mother's name is Sylvia, so that's why I'm kind of relating to you right now, right? So anyway, like if we got to control and create the policy, what a protocol of a human being would be and look like, and the standard of that human being, Sylvia, it's gonna look like me and you, right? Right? That's just the way the world works. So how we describe people, defining the norms, who we deem worthy and not worthy becomes the messages. Remember, putting yourself in that selfie shot, right? Your message to the world, right, is going to come through in what you share in your socials. Same thing we do in how we use an audience that also doesn't tolerate risk, that also sees, right? So you're following, right? So that also doesn't see the beauty in communities that are experiencing poverty, right? I knew I grew up in poverty. My mom loved me, right? I didn't even know we was poor until somebody said, well, you got hole in your pants, right? And then I kind of got offended because it was like peer pressure, but it still didn't bother me. My parents never were abusive toward me, but had somebody came to my house when my mother decided that it was best for me to have that meal and she go without eating, somebody might believe that she didn't have the means to take care of me. So the public perception is the audience becomes the public perception. The audience becomes the foster and adoption, the save and rescue, law enforcement, and our preventive services all have common ideology, common message, common audience, and our funding is attached to that. Now, just that alone doesn't get us very far. We need a way to distribute these messages, right? And so if I'm an author, if I'm a blogger, back to that social media thing again, I'm going to put it right here in the system. So how I recruit new workers is how I distribute that message, right? So when I have a CPS institution that has a caseload of 25 cases per worker, I'm going to go to the legislation as a director, and I'm going to say we need more funding, not to invest in families. We need more funding to recruit more workers so I can give 25,000 new people 25 cases per, right? Not to get the cases down. So we do it in training, our schools, the average childhood experiences, and telling the single story. I'm going to pause for just a moment and pull out that ACEs piece. because I think it's critically important for us to understand that when we are thinking about me change versus systems change, that we can no longer consider ourselves trauma informed if we're not race informed. Because there's a whole 300 and some odd year history before we got to Kaiser, Dr. Folletti in 95 and that study, right? It's a whole lot of racialized trauma that happened that we have not accounted for. And that is where the healing actually begins. Now we don't, so we've gone through the ideology, the message, the audience we need, the distribution sources that we have, and everything starts with power, right? So we need a plug. I don't know if you all watch or listen to hip hop or you got teen kids, right? But we all know what a plug is, right? So we need a source to power our narrative. Right, and our narrative is powered usually by white dominant led legislation, white dominant led political, the courts, the laws, the practices, the policies, and our interconnected, structurally interconnected systems. So that's how we get anti-Black messages out there into the ether. And in some, we talked about it earlier, in some, our history shapes our culture and our culture shapes our identity, right? And these things are like this infinity circle. We hide from talking about power and economics. Most of us think about racism in the way of bias and stereotype and the privileges that one has. Well, I got a little bit of privilege too, right? If we're talking about intra-racial privilege, right? I'm lighter skinned. I'm lighter skinned, I'm hetero male, right? I'm cisgen, I'm bald head. I'm gonna say I got privilege for being bald head, right? Like that's just my advantage. And so where I'm going is that we focus so much on what we think racism looks like rather than how it shows up in systems, right? So our interpersonal beliefs show up in how we write policy, protocol, which also upholds the structures that we have in place. And it's driven by, here in America anyway, theft of native land and the plantation became the two twins that created American capitalism, right? So when you think about all of this, then we have this other side of the movement, right? Where Black families and professionals are coming together to say that we're not abusing or neglecting our children. So if you want to go upstream, are you going to go upstream and divert funding while keeping and maintaining the same ideology, the same messaging, the same audiences, the same policies? So in some, are we giving more power to prevention services to carry out the bidding that currently child protection is doing if we don't change what's going on in us? So control, containment, exploitation, surveillance is what families say it feels like when we engage in services. Even when we know we need help, the trust has been broken. The social contract has been broken. Kimberly Jones says that racial trauma in my community looks like the same people that we call for help to help us are the same people that's hurting and killing us. And so some folks believe that it's time to abolish the system that we have now. Now, you know, that abolish might seem like a real harsh word to us all, but I tell you that it's really not, because if we know anything about history, right, as a person, we understand that the word abolish shows up 14 times in the Declaration of Independence, and it appears in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence that says, and I'll paraphrase here, and it's Googleable, it says that when systems become destructive and produce harm for the greater good, it's up to us as citizens to abolish said systems. And we have civic duties and responsibilities as individuals. Remember, what must happen first is we must take a stance as a person in our personhood, begin to see things differently, feel things differently, look at things differently, build different kinds of relationships. And then collectively, we can begin to change systems. I'm going to pull another piece of history here because I think it's critically important for us in the field of child abuse and neglect prevention, because I don't know if there are studies that have examined the similarities of what happened in the Kerner Commission report in 1967. So to give a brief snippet of what the Kerner Commission report is, it's a 11-member body commission that was commissioned by the late President Johnson in the 60s. This was as a result of what they called race riots, right? From Los Angeles to Florida to Newark, New Jersey. Studied all these riots. But to go back to that messaging and ideology, when we hear riots and we hear race, we tend to think that those individuals who are being impacted and harmed are the same ones that's starting the violence. That was the same belief that the Kerner Commission was told, because law enforcement told them that in all of these cities where individuals were burning down things based on racialized violence, that it was Black people who started the violence. Well, that myth was debunked because the commission asked a few questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And what can be done to, here's the word again, prevent it from happening again? Now, this was a very unique study, one of the first and also one of the last to have done this. They actually went into community and talked to people who were involved in the quote unquote race riots. They talked to law enforcement, they talked to clergy, talked to witnesses, bystanders, and victims of violence. What boiled down to is that individuals in those communities did not start the riots, did not start the violence in the riots. It was law enforcement that always pulled the trigger first. And so when we think about how we prevent things from happening, we have to understand the root of the issue, right? This is not a surface issue. It's a very intractable, complex problem. I know child abuse and neglect is, but I encourage you to think about how we might be able to use a study that was infused with people who were experiencing conditions of violence, chaos, segregation, marginalization, and racism. And so the report provided us with 3 strong recommendations. So in the field of preventing child abuse and neglect, we have to understand truly the severity of that problem. I think intellectually and emotionally and spiritually, we definitely know, right? It makes us cry when we think about it. It hurts our hearts when we think about it. However, I'm wondering, in your careers, have you seen us as a country mount programs on the scale to equal the dimension of that problem? If we did that, we can aim these programs exactly as the recommendation said, based on people dying, people hurting in the 60s, based on high impact, right? Programs aim for high impact in the immediate future in order to close the gap between promise and performance. And the other is to experiment and utilize wild imagination. Undertake new initiatives and experiments that can change the system, right? Not fix broken people, because people are not broken. If we continue to see people as broken as a helper, we're automatically going to feel like we need to fix them, right? So to undertake new initiatives and experiments that can change the system of failure and frustration that now dominates, the proverbial word there, now dominates the ghetto and weakens our society. There's ghettos, there's barrios, there's reservations, there's trailer parks still all across this country. Many of us may not live in them, Many of us may have grown in them, but many of us also may have been taught that we should leave those environments. And when we leave those environments, that's a sign of success. I say I want to stay in those environments. Sometimes I question myself because I send my child on purpose to a 90% Black school, 96 free and reduced lunch, because I do not believe that by my child sitting next to a white kid, he is miraculously going to get smarter. What I did know when I sent my child to a white school is that he was suspended a lot more frequently. His grades were not as good. The teachers did not recognize his goal because they were given carte blanche to tolerate biased, fueled, stereotypical behaviors based on the narrative that we have for young Black boys. And so when we look at when we mount programs that equal the magnitude and the severity of child abuse and neglect, we'll see that we're building a system that we want to live in, that we want to thrive. Back to the question of who am I becoming? I no longer want to be anti-child abuse and neglect. I no longer want to be anti-racist. I want to be pro-justice. I want to be pro-liberation. I want to be pro-thriving, right? Because if I think about how I build something versus how I stop something, I think I can use my dreaming and imagination in a lot of different ways. But when we know we have shrunk the system that we currently have, is when we're not celebrating foster and adoption any longer, which is directly linked to conflating neglect and abuse with poverty. When we are not tokenizing parents and youth and community members any longer. That means that not only are we co-researching and co-creating is the buzzword for the day, building liberated relationships with youth, parents, and community members, just to tell us their war stories, their horror stories, the worst time in their lives, but we're actually building vulnerable and transparent relationships where they can help us strategize to build that system of performance that we want to see. We'll also know that we've shrunk the system when we're no longer terminating parental rights, when we are not investing 10 times the amount of funding on placing children with strangers who have allegations of abuse and neglect, rather than supporting families to grow into their best selves. We've shrunk the system when we are not denying that we have a real problem. And that problem is complex. That problem does stem from an ideology and an animus toward people who might need a little help. And we know we shrunk the system when we are no longer utilizing mandated reporting as a weapon for control, fear, and policing. But that reporting system is utilized for what its purpose is, to report child abuse and neglect, for nothing else. And so for those of us, we may be asking at this moment, well, okay, well, what do I do? That's always the question. What do I do? How do I do it? Well, I want us to reset and think about that question. I believe it's not always how you do something. I think once you realize that it starts with me, starts with you as individuals, we then think about where we do the work, Some of us are focused on wanting only the data to shift. Some of us are focused on only wanting to prevent child abuse and neglect. Others of us are focused on what kind of future I want to see for my child. This may not happen in my lifetime. How can I begin to understand that at each and every decision point, I might have power or influence? How do I think about not only wanting the data to shift, but how I collect that data to shift? right? Developing new measures and matrices that make not only removing children harder, but also makes supporting families easier. Conducting participatory research with staff, families, communities to understand what must be eliminated in order to know what I need to grow, what seeds I need to plant, what must become anew. Learn to use data more effectively, right? Behind every case, there's a face, right? Causal influences are important for us and they shape positive trends. We usually think about the trends of things, families and staff perception of even services and support and the efficacy of those services and supports. The presence of something, not always when things are decreased. So the presence of increased procedural justice markers, meaning, and simply put, due process for families, same due process that you're entitled, families are entitled, that same due process. Rewriting the social contract. This is critically important because that social contract is broken, right? And we have to rewrite that contract so we can build liberation and trust with and amongst one another. And for those of us who want to continue to do the work and dive deep, deep into our souls, create space for radical, courageous conversations. And radical means, etymology speaking, the core. We're getting to the root, right? Respond versus react. Nothing is fixed, right? Forgive actively, not passively. Say yes to imagination, build community, right? Embrace non-reformist reform and practice accountability. And if I have time, I'll share exactly what practice accountability means and sounds like. And so the way that I think about this framework from the inside out is in the context of what I like to call it, mining for gold, learn, or lead rather. So there's the L in lead is learn. So there are some few things that we can do as individuals to begin to grapple with how I show up differently in this work. Learn about yourselves, what lies you've been told, right? What a positive racial identity is. Explore, right? The meaning of right accountable relationships. Understand what anti-oppressive practice looks like, feels like, right? For families. Think about the fact and the reality that empathy is quasi-empathy. I don't want people to walk in my shoes. I don't want people to experience some of the things that I've experienced in these systems. I don't want people to walk and feel the trauma and the pain and the scars that I have. But we can understand from a person's experiences that if I am not denying someone's experience, I'm seeing their full humanity. And think about somebody else's experiences, not as a spectator, right? But that you can recognize your humanity in them, right? That's the beauty. When I can recognize my humanity in somebody else, I see them as people. Act, intentionally seek areas where you do have control, right? On all the small things, act on all the small things that will inject humanity at each and every one of those decision points I mentioned. Include individuals with a level of expertise that you may not have at every level of your system. And then when you do these things, we begin to discover something amazingly exciting and rejuvenating about ourselves. We discover that liberation is freedom, right? We also begin to discover the importance and the value of proximity and undeniable knowledge that comes from direct experiential learning and practice. We also begin to discover that the infinite possibilities of humanity when true restorative justice is the center of all judiciary practice. Remember, child abuse and neglect, it does cut across the intersection of legalities, right? So I mentioned judiciary practice for a reason, because some of us believe that only the judge makes the decision if indeed something happened. But all of us can become stewards of Constitution and upholding those civic duties so we will not continue to infringe upon people's 4th and 14th Amendment rights. This is what we discover about ourselves. And we also discover that while you are so dependent on solving problems, loving problems. We have to understand the cause of them. I get it. But when we love problems more than we love the possibilities, we'll stay there, right? So it's important that through this work of becoming who you want to become in this world, that you no longer are so dependent and hell-bent on loving that problem more than you love the possibilities. And through that work, you can get to a place where you think about some questions that I'll have you to travel with. Are you the right person for this work? What does your community need the most from you? And in fact, how do you know? And then is your tendency around reform or revolution? And in what ways do you dream accountability? And the last slide said, stop making excuses, but I figured I'd just share that one. But there's something that I believe I might have 2 minutes to read to you. If I could, just get everybody to think about when you hear the word accountability, what you think about when you hear that word. Not only what you think about, but what characteristics do you attach to accountability, and also what emotions come up for you when you think about accountability. This is from Dream and Accountability. I'll share with Tracy the link so she can get it to you all post conversation. Some of us might think accountability is scary, right? Some of us might think accountability is about punishment, but I want to read something with you, and I hope that you can hang with me for maybe a minute or two over just to get this piece out. And this is from, Dream and Accountability, but what if accountability wasn't scary? Take a breath and let that sink in for a second. What if accountability wasn't scary? It'll never be easy or comfortable, but what if it wasn't scary? What if our own accountability wasn't something we ran from, but something we ran toward and desired, appreciated, held as sacred? What if we cherished opportunities to take accountability as precious opportunities to practice liberation, to practice love, to practice the kinds of people, elders to be, and souls we want to be, to practice that which can only be practiced in real time? After all, we can only practice courage when we are afraid, right? We can only practice taking accountability when we have wronged or harmed or hurt. Practice yields the sharpest analysis. Accountability is not a destination, it is a skill we can build and practice. It is an art, a craft, an alchemy we can learn, we can lean into how to wield, just as we have learned how to wield hurt and shame and fear. If accountability was a skill we value, then we must make room and make commitments to practice it ourselves every day, each week, each year. We can start small and build up. We can build up our skills from there. We can start with our everyday relationships and those closest to us, our families, our friends, our partners, our co-workers, the earth. We can start with our own self-accountability in the ways that we don't show up for ourselves. We can acknowledge how most of us are in abusive relationships with ourselves. We blow past our own boundaries. We punish and beat up ourselves in terrible ways. We can start with the ways we treat and even the ways we talk to ourselves, the ways we would clearly recognize as abuse if it were being done to another person. After all, our abusive relationships with ourselves lays the groundwork for an abusive world. What if we embraced accountability as reflection of our undeniable, incredible, tender humanity, a magnificent example of what it means to be human and flawed and in relationship with one another? What if we welcomed the quickening of our pulse, the beating of our hearts as a signal of being alive and caring, and what is most important to us, our relationships with one another? What if we listened to that fear, the fear of losing someone important to us or of losing ourselves? What if we rushed toward accountability and understood it as a gift we can give to ourselves and those hurting from our harm? What if we understood accountability not as some small, insignificant act, but as an intentional drop in an ever-growing river of healing, care, and repair, and that had the potential to nourish, comfort, and build back trust on a scale craving new paths carving new paths of hope, faith through mountains of fear and unacknowledged pain for generations. What if we understood the harms we've caused and have been a part of allowing, not as things that don't need to be tended to or things that will blow over or be forgotten about in time, but instead, in some small part, as a collective gaping wound that we have been taught to pretend away that sits in the middle of our hearts, our relationships, our families, our movements, our country, our world. What if we all understood our parts individually and collectively in that collective gaping wound? What if we understood that in a violent and oppressive world, the work of love is never done? What if accountability wasn't rooted in punishment, revenge, superficiality, but rooted in our values, growth, transformation, healing, freedom, and liberation? What if the work of accountability was held so supremely sacred that people who got to practice it, truly practice it, were considered lucky, and those who had the honor of supporting it and witnessing it were also changed for the better by its power? What if we understood that no amount of tough love or punishment could ever hold a candle to the long and hard labor, fear, and pain of facing our demons and our traumas? What if we learned to desire the challenging and the transformative instead of the easy and the comfortable? After all, comfort and transformation do not live on the same block. What if we stopped romanticizing transformation and genuinely understood that true transformation requires a death and a birth, a letting go and a starting new? What if we spent more time practicing accountability, not just talking about it? So often we want other people to be accountable, but what if we practice our own accountability more? What if we started with the small things and built up our skills with the big things? What if we remembered that addressing the small things better helps us prevent the big things? What if we talked with each other about the things we're trying to be more accountable for? What if we built relationships where we could have nuanced conversations about accountability, shame, fear, guilt, embarrassment, insecurity, trauma, and healing? What if we took more time to dream accountability? What it could be like, what it could be, and the kind of magic it could grow. What we need in order to practice it more and be better, both individually and collectively. What if accountability was so normalized, so everyday, run of the mill, that it was second nature, that it was our default, that it was something that everyone knew about, and you could easily pass a group of children and youth of any age casually talking about it? What if accountability was not scary? It will never be easy or comfortable. But what if it wasn't scary? Our accountability wasn't something we ran from, but something we ran toward, a desire and appreciated, held as sacred. What if we cherished opportunities to take accountability as precious opportunities to practice liberation and to practice love? That's my hill, good people. And I hope someone found it to be worth the 64 minutes.
Thank you so much, Corey. I'm not sure if we wanted to take a moment to see if anybody had any questions or comments, if you wanted to take yourself off mute, if you wanted to put it in the chat, if you're shy, but I know a lot of the people on the call and they're not shy, but if you wanted to put it in the chat, I'll read it. I'll just wait a moment to see if anybody has anything to add.
Yeah, I would love to see if anybody.
I just want to say thank you. It's, you know, it's like how you're saying, like the accountability has to start with us, and that we spend so much time on what everybody else is doing or what everybody else is not doing, and we need to ask ourselves those questions. But I think you know, there's always a good space to have triggering conversations, or, you know, like when we're having this conversation, not every trigger has to be a negative trigger. So for me, these are positive questions that are triggering me to really just find a different perspective and really look at things a little bit different, and not get stuck in my own way of only seeing things one way, or thinking, you know, that we have to do things or resolve things that, you know, only one way. We really, like, the innovation really has to be we have to start really feeding into innovation and creativity.
Absolutely. Well said. I'm learning, right? It's nothing perfect about this practice. Right? So I hope you don't think that I was preaching something that I don't struggle with myself, right? So I'm a human, just like you, fallible, right? I am not all knowing, but I definitely suit up and try to do something better tomorrow that I didn't do yesterday so well. Like share my slide screen with efficacy. I'll practice that too.
I have Andy in the chat, Andy, and he is saying when referring to the power resources section, part of that is laws, practices, and policies. Is there any policy you feel needs more attention, support in our field? Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, definitely, Andy. Thank you. I believe that one, Andy, we have to be able to analyze policy through a justice-centered lens, right? So most policies are written innocuous, right? They're written, there's that word again, race neutral. They're written neutral, right? So when we know the policies are written neutral, how can we rewrite policies that support the investments that's needed in those communities where the bridges aren't being invested in enough, right? How can we take bold stances, Andy, and say that we should not create policies that'll just blanket everybody, but let's look at who really needs and start to create policy and protocol to invest there, to practice there differently, to program there differently. And the final thing that I'll say is when I think, Andy, of national policy, yes, it drives, it's part of the structure. I totally understand the challenges there. But I think it also gives us an opportunity to hide behind something else, Andy, because again, people make policy. We can't change people's hearts and minds. That's never my job. I want you to come into the conversation with your heart there. But Andy, when you in your sphere of influence can say, what's the workaround or the work straight through, even if policy doesn't change, how can we do something justice-centered that creates belonging and that builds a better community? We don't need a policy to be human beings with people, and we're never going to get legislated compassion.
Very true. Anyone else? Thank you so much, Andy, for the chat. Anybody else want to put in the chat or take yourself off mute? Andy said very well said. Thank you.
Now, if you wanted to look, thank you, Andy. If you really wanted to tackle the policy, though, we can look at that CAPTA and chop it up, buddy.
And also, just so you know, everybody on the call and who signed up, we will, obviously we're recording this right now, so we will be sending the video on the YouTube channel to you. So you will have that if you wanted to share Mr. Best's presentation from tonight. And so I'm not seeing anyone else in the chat. So I think if we can all give a round of applause, a virtual round of applause to Mr. Best. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it. Very, very thought-provoking, really, like you said, you put a lot into the hours. So we really appreciate it. So again, also to everyone on the call, on the Zoom call, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday. This is the final child abuse prevention speaker series. So for those of you who have been to all four or a couple, we hope it was informative. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And again, once more, thank you, Mr. Best, for your presentation today. Very appreciated.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. And just so you know, we're going to bring you back. You're not getting away that easily. Our community here in the Antelope Valley really needs these conversations. They're not about presenting to the community, but it's more about offering a platform to have these conversations. And our community really has had some really high profile cases with the children. I mean, that led to obviously Netflix movies and all that, but we really need to further this conversation.
Absolutely. I will hold you to that, Sylvia. So we can co-create what that container looks like and needs to feel like for people.
So again, this was the final child abuse prevention speaker series. So thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate it, and we wish you you all a good evening and the rest of the week. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tracy and team. Talk soon, all right?
For sure.
All right.